welcome to Bow Ties. I sometimes call myself Ashley and Ed.
So unfortunately, James couldn't make it tonight, which is a shame because he prepped some questions, and I know he desperately wanted to be on this one, but we couldn't make it happen. So basically, you're going to read all the questions, Ed. Sorry to break it to you. So without further ado, can you introduce who is our guest tonight?
This evening, we're really proud to be joined by writer and script editor Max Kashevsky. Good evening, Max.
Oh, thanks so much. Glad to be here.
And really, I'm just going to ask you a few questions about your life and career in general. So, if you're happy to answer some questions, that'd be fantastic. So, Max, I like to research our guests before they come on, and I've been researching you online for a couple of days, but I can't find a lot out about you apart from your Twitter bio, which says writing Doctor Who stuff, PhD in politics stuff. So, really, to begin, if you can tell us a bit about your background and how did you get started as a writer?
Yeah, and that's probably just the witness protection, all my mob activities. So yeah, as you can tell from the accent, I come from America. I'm from Florida, and I've lived in the UK for about 10 years now since university. And yeah, I've been a Doctor Who fan since really since the show came back, at least when it started airing in America, which was I think about 2006. Weirdly, it's because my mom was actually the big Doctor Who fan. She was, watching Tom Baker in the late 70s on PBS at odd hours and stuff. So because of that, she sort of watched it and then said, "Oh, this old show I used to watch is back on. Come along, let's watch it." And yeah, fell in love with it from there. And then it sort of took over my entire life like a parasitic brain worm or something.
It does tend to do that. Yeah, it's you can't you get sort of completely drawn in, completely immersed, and you end up living and breathing it, and it's all you talk about, and your house is full of stuff with associated with it. Well, mine is, but there we are. So your love of Doctor Who then has got you into being a writer for the wonderful Big Finish. What do you see as your breakout moment, the moment where something you enjoy suddenly you realize this is actually making a mark, people are taking notice?
Oh, I mean, I think it probably would have to be the first story I did, Still Life, which came out in 2019 as a subscriber bonus short trip. So if you bought some of the main range stories, that's how old this story is now, that there used to be a main range for Big Finish. Um, and it was a very personal story. And not that many people have heard it. It didn't make such a massive mark just because it was difficult to get a hold of and still is. But the people who did hear it, I just got such a great response, and it really chimed with a lot of people's experiences, because it's a story that deals with family members dying and grief and all that stuff. And it was a story that I felt was weirdly absent in Doctor Who, partially because I think there's a kind of fear of being too on the nose sometimes when it comes to, big issues and things like that. You don't want a Doctor Who story to feel gauche or anything. So the sort of interesting challenge of that one was trying to find a way to tell a story that was, very depressing to be honest, but do it in a way that's still a fun, exciting, pulpy Doctor Who adventure that doesn't feel like it's, you know, trying too hard or making some horrible, embarrassing missteps, and trying to be sort of like the definitive take on something, for instance. So yeah, and so I think that story was really for me where it felt like, oh, this is something I can do and I can do more of, and so far that's worked out.
Fantastic. And that story was originally submitted as part of the annual Paul Spragg Memorial competition. Uh, I mean, that's something that a lot of prospective writers try every year, and you're obviously very talented. One of the ones that Big Finish have chosen to be on that. But coming into it from that angle, what advice would you give to prospective writers who want to enter that competition?
Mm. Yeah, I think the main thing with that competition is probably just that uh, it's an absolutely massive number of stories that get submitted year on year, right? I mean, it's still something like 1,000 people after all this time, still, 1,000 submissions every year. And if you think about if it only takes the person who runs the short trips range, which is currently Peter Angelides, if it takes him 5 minutes to read one submission, do the math, and it's insane the amount of time that it takes up. So it has to sort of stand out in an interesting way. And I think that means writing something that is not necessarily, putting your heart in your sleeve, not necessarily trying to do the most innovative Doctor Who thing ever, but it should, I think, feel like a story that only you could have written. It has to feel like something very unique to you. So, for instance, my friend Ben Teds won the competition one year, and it's a really great 12th Doctor sort of comedy story about somebody who sells ideas, to warlords and things like that. And it's such a him story. It's not that it's a story that necessarily tells the most heartbreaking, or devastating adventure ever. It's just it's the kind of quirky thing that only he could have come up with. So it's a very weird sort of bit of advice, but sort of figuring out, what's the sort of spin that you can put on Doctor Who is actually, I think, part of the key to this, that you're not just trying to imitate somebody else's way of doing the story, but like, what is your sort of, what do you find interesting about the format? What do you find people haven't really done before that you're surprised about? That sort of thing.
I mean, in a funny sort of way, it's a similar situation. I don't know if you had them in the USA, but the New Adventures novels in the early 90s, where they were taking on brand new writers who were coming at it from completely different angles, but it was still recognizably Doctor Who.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, and it's that feeling of sort of writerly ownership, which I think is something that is really makes the short trips stand out in a way. Because a lot of the full cast stories, full cast is absolutely brilliant, but there's, because there's not the prose element, you have less of the kind of like the writer hanging over your shoulder as you listen to the story. There's a lot more of your own personal voice that goes into it and the way you can tell the story, I think. Because in a way that means you're kind of, you know, you're not just the writer, you're also sort of the director as well, leading the story along and pacing it in a certain way. So yeah, I think that's one of the reasons I absolutely love the short trips. It's one of my favorite little corners of Doctor Who. So
Fantastic. I mean, your short strip trip, Still Life as well, not only got made, got produced, but also has added to the myth and the lore of Doctor Who by introducing Joe Grant's father, Terry. I mean, you have made your mark on the legend. How does that feel?
I mean, adding something to your TARDIS wiki is everybody's main goal in life, I have to think, right? Anyone who doesn't think that is nuts. No, I think what's for me, what's really fun about that, it wasn't just giving Joe um, a dad. It was the way that he in that story sort of symbolizes her um, a sort of very like new Who tension about um, the difference between Doctor life and real life, which is something that the unit era is sort of really like primed to explore, right? It's you have to think, Joe Grant has to get up in the morning, brush her teeth, go to the office, and then she runs into a Doctor Who story every day, after getting the coffee for herself. And that is like it's a very different dynamic to anything else you ever get in the show. The fact that not just for the Doctor that he's trapped on Earth, but that Joe is also, in a way, a companion who, until her third series, doesn't get to function like a normal companion most of the time. So that's what that story was partly about. It was, the way her dad coming down with a terminal illness means that she has to suddenly confront the fact that, even though she is best friends with a time traveler, she doesn't have all the time in the world. And she has to sort of balance her time at unit, her time just getting a paycheck, while also having to deal with the fact that her dad is running out of time, and that's where in the story there's a sort of Faustian bargain where she gets the chance to stop time from an alien, and that's to spend time with her dad while the world is sort of on pause. And that's where that all comes from. I think it's that sort of feeling of like wanting to sort of suspend time and be with somebody you love. So yeah, that's why I really loved writing that character. And also, I guess, sort of side fun fact is that he was obviously named after Terrence Dicks because who else is sort of an appropriate father figure, I guess.
And I mean, after that, then came your next short trip, which was Salvage. How different an experience was writing that to writing Still Life?
Yeah, it was very different because from the off, I was actually handed a sort of handed a premise. Essentially, Alfie Shaw, who was the producer of that range, he had heard me on a podcast talking about how Doctor Who stories should be more political. Can be more political, and that you can also, you can use the sort of existing trappings of like certain monsters and things to talk about politics. And he just sort of fired the hardest premise at me, which was essentially just do a Doctor Who story about a refugee crisis, um, but the Doctor can't just solve it at the end. He can't just wrap everything up in a neat bow and say, well, in Doctor Who land, you can just solve the worst problems in history, like that. So that was a real challenge. And it took me a couple tries to get it right, actually. Whereas I think Still Life came out, it just sort of flowed out very easily from an outline that I'd already sent in for the competition. Um, with Salvage, there was a lot more back and forth about what kind of story, where should it be set. Like, at first it was going to be a story set in a kind of, I don't know, just a sort of like a space-time refugee camp in a much more, I think, generic sense. And a version of that might have worked, but I think what the story was missing was a sense of um, one just from getting from A to B, a sort of real trajectory. If you're just sort of wandering around a refugee camp thinking, refugee crises are terrible, that's, it's obviously very true, but it's not good drama from a Doctor Who perspective. And then on top of that, you had the issue of the lack of emotional investment from the Doctor and the companion, Bliss, who was the Eighth Doctor's Time War companion. Um, and there was a real risk of it feeling a bit heavy-handed if it's just, two people who have no direct emotional involvement walk into a situation, realize that it's very bad, and then kind of solve it a bit. It just didn't quite work dramatically. So a lot of what the story became was about, like I said, giving it a real sense of momentum, which was by setting it all on a strange train that travels through time and space, with different compartments being filled with refugees from different time periods. And then giving Bliss a real emotional investment in it by just having her in her childhood, having an interesting encounter with a refugee. And of course, Bliss later, by the time she becomes the Doctor's companion, the whole thing is that she is also herself a kind of temporal refugee because the version of her home world that she comes from has been erased. Um, and so the story is sort of, she gets to the end of the train, essentially, she hopes that she might sort of find some answers to, sort of like what happened to her home. Is there anything left of her home somewhere out there in time and space? Are there people maybe who, just like the refugees on this train, might have survived and might be waiting for her at the end of the line? So that's where all that came in. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you've used the character of Bliss and the Eighth Doctor. Um, was it always an Eighth Doctor and Bliss story, or did the story evolve through the writing process?
No, it always was an eight and Bliss story. And I think it needed to be that. Sort of just like how Still Life, I think, could have only been told with, the third Doctor being Earthbound. I think similarly, this sort of story really needed it to be specifically the Time War and specifically somebody who's been affected by the war herself. So, that was just serendipity.
Fantastic. So your next contribution to Big Finish was All's Fair, a full cast story as part of a sprawling, complex arc featuring the 11th Doctor. How did you rise to the challenge of becoming part of this epic?
Oh, it's a very flattering way of asking that question. Yeah, it was it was definitely a challenge. So the way that came about was I had basically, after writing Salvage, I'd become sort of online pals with Alfie Shaw, who, in addition to being the Short Trips producer, was also producing the Doctor Chronicles. And he, I'd sort of said to him, like, I'd be interested in trying to script edit someday. And he offered to let me shadow him, which was really lovely. And a friend of mine had done a similar thing on the recent Sontarans versus Rutens range. And so there was it's a sort of exciting opportunity to sort of get, behind the scenes a little bit. So I kind of joined that series from the midpoint, the second half of those box sets. And it was such an interesting way of understanding how script editing works, because the thing is that most Big Finish doesn't actually work this way for obvious reasons. Most of it is not a contained, 14 episode series 7 length arc, which, because you can't introduce Tegan and Nissa again and leave them again. So, if you're doing most of these stories, you can't really do the typical Doctor Who thing. But with the new companion of Valerie, you got a really nice, lovely, contained short arc across these box sets. So essentially, shadowing him as a script editor meant I got a really great sense of how to get all these stories to flow together, how to make each episode very individually just a strong, lovely episode on its own, but also trying to build on things that had been done in the previous two box sets. And so when it came about that there was an open slot in the third box set, then Alfie essentially punted it over to me, which is very lovely. And we'd come up with this idea for it. I guess I'm fine to say spoilers at this point. It's been out for a while. That it was essentially Valerie's on a date with somebody, Roanna, from a previous episode, at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, and she is, having a lovely date, and then suddenly somebody runs up to her and says, hello, I'm your future husband. I'm essentially Mr. Lockwood. So it's which is a really fun thing, and I think part of the reason I got the opportunity was obviously because I'd been working with Alfie already on this arc, because I knew where it had been and where it was going. It didn't take as much for me to get caught up to speed as it might have been somebody else. So I kind of knew where all the characters had to be at the end and everything. And yeah, it was just such a really exciting thing to work on. Like there was a real moment when we were batting around ideas for what to do with this episode where I'd sort of said, what if, I sort of said, well, we need something big, like what if somebody comes up and says, hi, I'm Mr. Lockwood, but obviously we can't do that. And Alfie said, no, we can do that, and we are doing that. We have to do that as soon as he heard that. So that was, very heartening.
And you've moved then with that from narrated, short stories to full cast. How did you approach that differently? How different an experience was that?
It's very different, yeah. Because obviously, if you think about it, with prose, if you need to, give the dialogue a bit of a break, if you need to move the conversation on, whatever, you have every tool at your disposal. You have the kind of camera of the story. But with full cast, every bit of dialogue has to be contributing something, and every line has to be, paced just right, and making sure that, you have to make sure the scene's not too long so that you're not sitting in the same room for too long. You have to make sure that, if you're cutting between different scenes, that, you're not focusing on certain characters too much and certain characters too little. And, for instance, there's a bit in this story where the Doctor goes off with Mr. Lockwood and explores his Lockwood Foundation, where he's doing all sorts of steampunk experiments and things, and figures out all these secrets about what's going on there. And then meanwhile, Valerie and Roanna are dealing with the fact that they've just found out that, ostensibly they don't have a future with their relationship, and they're just kind of going on the sort of dregs of a weird dead date. And then they get attacked by a monster. But when you're doing both of those little scenes, you have to make sure that you're cutting between them in a way that makes dramatic sense while also making sure that you're not spending too much time on the page with one character, and you're also not spending too much in-universe time in one place than another, right? Like if one scene is happening over an hour and the other scene feels like it's happening in 5 minutes, it doesn't make sense to intercut them, right? So dealing with all that was actually shockingly difficult, but it's also, I think, what's fun about doing full cast audio is, it is sort of real stagey drama, and you get the kind of fun rhythms of doing big cliffhanger stings at the end of scenes and things like that. And also having the challenge of making sure that the dialogue is constantly propelling you forward, without feeling like it's being too overly quippy or anything. So, yeah.
And I suppose as well as your original creation, you had to sort of make sure the arc elements went in as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Trying to make sure that that everything lined up perfectly. Because all these characters all return in the next box set, Victory of the Doctor. So yeah, that's a real challenge. But I think it's also partially why, like I said, sort of being a bit behind the scenes on this definitely helped in making sure that, I wasn't writing anything that would throw the entire series off the rails or anything.
And you're saying you've been a bit behind the scenes on that box set, which leads me on to my next point that you now are fully behind the scenes. And you've gone really from being a writer, which you still are a writer, but you've also gone to being also a script editor. How did this happen? Was it sort of something you just fell into or something you actively sought?
Well, I'd actively sought it because, as I said, I'd been shadowing Alfie as a script editor, and so he very kindly punted this box set over to me. It was originally Matt Fitton's gig, but I think, was very busy at the time, and so he was already thinking about he was a little overcommitted at the moment, and Alfie very kindly suggested my name. So I took over the box set. While I, not super long into the production. I'd say we were probably only like 10 or 15% through with it or something like that, if that. We essentially had a rough outline for the middle story, and then he'd solicited one of the other writers already, who was the brilliant Theo Trethewey. And so yeah, we had that, but apart from that, it was pretty vague. He'd also and also Matt had already suggested bringing back a monster that he'd helped invent in the previous box set. So yeah, apart from that, it was a pretty clean slate.
And the title of this box set that you've script edited is You Only Die Twice. It's a very, very Bond-esque title. Why was this title chosen?
Yeah, it's because we essentially realized we needed some kind of interesting hook for the box set, right? And if anyone's listened to the previous one, Time Jacked, you don't need to have heard it, but it is brilliant to follow along with You Only Die Twice. But in that one, Kira Sandstrom, who's a sort of young time agent, kind of time jacks the Doctor by pointing a gun in his face and having him take her to another planet in his TARDIS because her vortex manipulator is broken. And then so in this story, we thought we need something, again, like that, something really big and bold and weird to really hook everyone in. And we came up with the concept of Kira sort of time jacking him again, but not to steal his TARDIS, but to sort of steal him, to sort of recruit him on a mission. So she slaps a vortex manipulator on him and starts calling him Agent Doctor. And it's a kind of, what's fun about that is you get throughout the box set a real sort of like tension between these two characters because they're both kind of, wink, wink, nudging each other the whole time. He's in Georgia Cook's story, Sunstrike, which is the first in the box set. One of the things I love about it is the Doctor, he's been recruited as a time agent and he has to infiltrate a luxury weapons auction. And he has to pretend to be a villain because obviously the only people who are going to be at a weapons auction are the galaxy's biggest baddies. So he has to pretend to be Dr. Destructo, and he comes up with the name because he basically does the entire adventure sarcastically, which I love. It's a very 12th Doctor sort of premise, the whole thing, making him have to deal with the kind of authority that he always is fighting against. The man who hates soldiers has to kind of become a soldier in a sense, become a sort of MI5 CIA kind of person. It's really fun.
I listened to it over the last week or so just to prep for this one, and I've got to say, my favorite line that I've heard in Doctor Who in the last 12 months is the Big Bang, like Britpop, it's inevitable, or something like that. Was that one of yours, or was that one of the writers? Or was it Theo's one, I think?
It was in Theo's episode. I can't remember how that came about. Sometimes when you're script editing things, it's a bit like an accumulation, like you're kind of riffing on each other's joke. I don't remember which how that came about, but I really do love that line. Yeah.
Yeah, that was fantastic. I was here with my headphones on listening to it, and I just burst out laughing. My wife looked at me, what's wrong with him? But no, best line I've heard in absolutely ages. So pass on the thumbs up to Theo when you speak to him.
Oh, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Now, Ed, as I mentioned at the beginning, you're now going to read in James's questions flawlessly, as if James was here. The listeners won't know. They'll be fine. They'll be fine. So take it away, mate. Take it away.
So Max, as well as your writing and script editing work for Big Finish and your other writing, you're also a PhD candidate in political studies at Cambridge. I'm curious how consciously your area of academic expertise crosses into your storytelling. Is it a case of being a general truth that a writer's passions are always going to seep into their work, or is it the part of you that wants to convey a particular message through your tales?
Mm. Yeah, I think my area of expertise specifically, not so much. If I were a historian in Hamlet studies or something, I'd probably want to write Doctor Who meets Hamlet. But I research the idea of luxury in politics, so intellectual history, so things like that. What people in the 18th century thought about the idea of luxury and how it was corrupting society or how it was going to advance society, that sort of thing. And there are elements of that I think definitely do bleed into my work. But on the whole, I think what it gives me is, not so much a specific message that you want to get across, but more a general sense of, I think, things that really, I think, hopefully chime with what Doctor Who's all about anyway, which is, maybe a kind of macro perspective. I like stories that sort of focus on very, very big things, even if they're, just about a train compartment or something. They're about sweeping ideas, and also a sense of sort of righteous anger. I love stories that are about goodies beating baddies, that kind of thing. I mean, it's all very obvious, but like I think yeah, it's not so much my specific area of expertise, but I think what it does allow for is the sort of, at least for me personally, I think it's the realization that everything is politics at some level or other. All sort of social interactions, all kind of debates and TV and film and all that. It's all about just discussing ideas and discussing how the world is and how it should look. And that's all politics really is. Even if it's not party politics, it's still a form of politics. And that's, I think, that's the thing that I find really fun and also really challenging about writing stories, because it does kind of lead me into a very like three layers of metaphor debate whenever I'm trying to outline a story, to say like, but what if it gets interpreted as this? Or what if, I'm kind of implicitly, by having the Doctor defeat the baddie in this way, I'm sort of implicitly saying this about society, which is probably not the healthiest way to think about writing a Doctor Who story. Because it definitely leads me to overthink things on 7 different levels. But yeah, I hopefully gives me more positives than negatives.
That's great, thanks. I'm thinking in particular about your 8th Doctor short strip story, Salvage, and the beautifully skillful way it portrays refugees, in this case from the Time War. It's very moving how you portray them in that story, being voicelessly pushed further and further from where they want to be until they eventually fade away. What was the inspiration behind that representation?
So it was 2 things. One is the very obvious metaphor that you've picked up on, the idea that it's kind of literalizing the idea of voicelessness. That refugees are forcibly often made to be ignored in society and sort of shunted into camps where they can't interact with normal society. And there are refugee voices out there. There's beautiful. I read a couple of books, especially like fiction. A lot of short stories written by refugees. And so it's not to say that in a kind of like normative sense that I think refugees are voiceless, but it's the way that they are made to be voiceless in a metaphorical sense. obviously. Anyway, that's one of my 7 layers of overthinking. But I think more or like less obviously, it's also the fact that it helps get rid of a very obvious script problem, which is that if you're going to have a story about the Doctor and Bliss going down a train where, from the back to the front, it's, the people towards the front of the train are the people who've been there for longer because the train's kind of like spitting out new carriages as it goes along, right? It just means that if you're going to do that story, you don't want it to be the Doctor and Bliss stopping at every single carriage and meeting a new group of people and having to say, "Hello, I'm the Doctor and Bliss," blah, 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 blah. That is just going to be a huge obstacle in the story. And it also risks being very pat. Like, I think the problem was I didn't want the story to be something about me trying to speak for refugees and just have a couple of characters whose entire personality is just them coming up and saying, "What's happening to me is very bad," obviously, but you want, these are people with real, interesting, complex lives beyond just the fact that they are trapped on this train. So that's the problem is, yeah, trying to find a way to make their presence important in the story without having to deal with their presence as being like a kind of dialogue obstacle or for, a way for me to kind of just use them as a mouthpiece instead of letting them just kind of exist in the story.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much. And James, next question again is all about the story Salvage. So Salvage is a particular pleasure for me because of its full-blown embrace of more metaphysical story elements, which I always love to see in Doctor Who. You've also talked in articles about more meta interpretations of the show, especially in the Capaldi era, and its substitution of the historical cameo of New Who with fantasy or legendary figures. How perfect a vehicle is Doctor Who as a concept and the Doctor as a character to explore these more meta potentials?
I think there is a lot of meta potential there, but the constant problem that you have with Doctor Who is it's 45 minutes or an hour. You need to have a kind of pulpy adventure where in the end, the Doctor more or less usually saves the day or something. You encounter a kind of threat that propels the story forward. So, on the one hand, Doctor Who is a limitless, bundle of storytelling potential that allows you to get all, kinds of twisty metaphysical insights into your stories. But on the other hand, it's trying to balance that with, the sort of obvious fact that like, well, you need to get words on the page and, your deadline's tomorrow and you haven't written the last scene yet. So yeah, it is a really good metaphysical vehicle in a lot of ways. Like, but I think you have to kind of find tricks to doing that, right? So like with the two examples that you've listed there, like Salvage, having the format be there's a train that's going through time and space, stopping at different wars or different moments in the time war and picking up different refugees as an offering to bring them somewhere they'll be safe. That allows you to then have the Doctor, deal with a very simple Doctor Who story, get to the end of the train. But outside in the window, through the window, you can see all kinds of wacky metaphysical stuff going on. I loved putting in a couple of really strange time worry things going on outside that would be very difficult to actually have the Doctor, deal with in a normal episode. And then with the example of the 12th Doctor, yeah, like I've talked about how the Capaldi era does an interesting thing that I called, I think, the celebrity mythological story. So the trick with that is, there are obviously celebrity historicals, and the Capaldi era very uniquely, I think, has a tendency to stick a bunch of not historical figures, but mythic figures. So there's, Robin Hood, and you get a kind of Superman analog, you get Odin, you get Santa Claus, and then you eventually get Doctor Who himself when the first Doctor turns up as his own kind of fairy tale mythic figure, right? And yeah, the trick with that is trying to do something new with an existing format. So you can get very metaphysical with it, but it's because you're sort of playing within what the audience is expecting in terms of a celebrity historical episode that the RTD era had already established very beautifully. So yeah, so I think that's the thing is like you can always do unique, interesting, twisty things with Doctor Who, but you have to trick the audience into not realizing that they're listening to, you know, a very pedestrian script that has to deal with the fact that the Doctor has to overcome certain obstacles to make the adventure happen, that sort of thing. It is basically just a trick. That's what's fun about writing.
Fantastic. And the last question James has is that evolution into editing alongside writing a continual one, do you think? Might we be sitting down in a few years' time to listen to stories directed or produced by Max Kashevsky?
I think probably not as a director or a producer. I think I wouldn't mind producing. I think it's the work a producer does is very fun, and you have a lot of responsibilities on the day of recording. And I've been able to go to a couple of recordings now, and it is really really exciting. But yeah, it's I think script editing is definitely where my heart is. So I'm hopefully I'll get the chance to do some more things at some point soon. Because yeah, I think it's helping shape the scripts that for me is the most exciting aspect of it. And I think you could definitely leave the directing up to people like Lisa Bowerman and Helen Goldwyn, who've done amazing work on the episodes I've done. Um, they know a hell of a lot more than I do about how a scene should feel, like it's amazing when you're sitting in a recording studio and, thanks to the director's work, you have like in your head the way that a scene should play out, and suddenly you just hear it exactly the way you thought it was going to be as the actors just do it live. And they give little tweaks and just, say a word more like this. It's great. Yeah, and producing is a lot of scheduling, and I have severe ADHD, so less likely, but I wouldn't mind giving it a go.
That's absolutely amazing. Max, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much for answering our questions. Ash, I'm going to hand on to you to wrap up.
Brilliant, brilliant. Edward, thank you very much for all your efforts there, reading in your questions. Reading your questions, not reading in your questions, and reading James's questions as well. Starman, Starman. Max, you have been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. I really, really, really appreciate your time. And what's left to say? Well, my usual. On that bombshell, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.